And so, resuming with the story of my life, chapter 4, I want to preface this by saying that I agree. I'm not a big Jordan Peterson fan, but I agree with him that, or what he says about in the first chapter of Maps of Meaning, that you should write out an autobiography. No matter what stage of life you're in, you should at least write it out in like a diary or a notebook for yourself. It's an excellent tool to give you perspective on where you've been and where you might then go from that point. It just helps orient you. And it's like the first step in any kind of recovery program or healing process. They want you to know where you've been, who hurt you, who you hurt, where your resentments are. It's basic stuff in recovery programs like AA and things like that. I highly recommend doing it, no matter how old you are. Just do it. Sit down and write it out. So now where we left off was the summer between high school and college. Now, during the December of my last year of high school, my aunt died, the aunt who had given me unconditional love. She died, and that was the first time a close relative of mine had ever died. So I had to experience that, going through the loss, losing her, and her love. She was wonderful. And she left us a little bit of money, not a lot, but a bit. And my mother was managing it because my brother and I were still minors at the time. And so we went to New York City the following summer, in June, I believe, the following summer. So we went to New York, and New York was it was amazing. It was whereas Phoenix is huge too, but whereas Phoenix is an expansive, horizontal, urban sprawl type of city, New York is compressive, and it bears down on you as you're walking through those streets. You can feel this behemoth just imposing its might and mightiness on you everywhere you go. And there's so much energy, possibly due to the compressiveness and claustrophobia of that environment. There's just so much energy and activity. The place is just crackling, humming, people doing stuff, and all these ethnicities. And it's an amazing thing. It's a modern equivalent of Babylon, and a massive megalopolis, a world city. And it was just amazing going there and experiencing that. So we came back from that vacation, and when we came back then, we were living with my grandmother, my maternal grandmother, during that period. Then my mother moved to a new house, renting a new house right around the corner from her. But I drove back to go visit my friends, my childhood friends that I had grown up with, and the same ones that I'd done all the LSD trips with. And I stayed with them for maybe a week or so, maybe two, something like that, in this apartment complex where they had moved. And they were now doing crack cocaine. So they had moved on to harder drugs, which I refused to do. That was a line I wasn't going to cross. I just knew that was a line, not going to happen, not going there. And they would sit around smoking this crack pipe, and they would keep offering it to me, and I kept refusing, would not do it, under no circumstances or conditions was I, because I knew where that was going to go, and it was totally predictable. And so I just watched them over that period of time go downhill into various psychoses. The older brother of my high school friend it was his apartment, and he was a biker. He was a hardcore guy, just a guy you didn't fuck with. Wore a leather jacket with the bike logo on his back. I got along with him just fine, but he was a guy who you didn't cross. Bad things were known to happen to people that crossed this guy. So I was living in this apartment, watching them smoke all this crack cocaine, and pretty soon they were indeed selling off all the furniture in the apartment. Things were beginning to disappear as they went to local pawn shops. Even though they had jobs, they still did not have enough money to support the habit. And this was like I was living with 3 or 4 individuals in this 2-bedroom apartment, I think, at this time. And so I wound up sleeping on the floor. Once they sold the couch, there was no couch to sleep on. So I was just sleeping in this apartment on the floor. And so, yeah, it was not a good scene. And I knew it was going to be time to get out of there. And the call to get out of there came one night when the biker came rushing into the apartment and said, "John, you were never here. You were never here. You were never here," pointing fingers at everybody, telling us we weren't there. And I knew enough not to ask any questions. I just got up and went out the door, went into my car, and drove around the corner. And as I was going around the corner, I saw his bike lying in the middle of the street, broken up. Someone had hit it, or he had hit someone. Either way, he left the scene of an accident, so there was some definite trouble there. So I didn't ask, I didn't want to know. I left and went back home to live with my mother in this new house that they were renting around the corner from my grandmother's. But I did hear later on that the parents of the biker and his younger brother, who was my friend, these parents lived just right around the corner from where I grew up, same neighborhood that the kid shot himself in, only further down that same street. That the parents, whom I had met and the mother was very jovial and talkative and wonderful, and the father was a nice guy, always buried in a newspaper, and he'd move the newspaper and look at you and give you a wink or whatever, and then go back to his newspaper. Totally nice guy, never said a word. They were counterfeiting money out of that house. Believe this or not, I'm not kidding. They were making counterfeit money, and it was working. They were buying things with it. It was apparently convincing enough to buy shit with. And so I heard about this through the grapevine, and then my friend, the childhood friend, not the younger brother of the biker, but this other childhood friend, the one who out shoplifted me, he got busted for something or other. It might have been buying drugs or cocaine or something like that. He got busted, and the FBI made a deal with him they knew about the family doing the counterfeiting, and they made a deal with him to put a wire on him to go in and help get a conviction for my friend's family, which he then subsequently did, and then I guess he disappeared into witness protection because I never heard him again after that. I never heard a word from him after that. So that ends that chapter of my life with those kinds of people. So now it was the summer. I was getting ready for college. I wasn't looking forward to it. I didn't want to do it. I wasn't interested in going, and I almost didn't go. I went down to the registrar to register for classes, and I got overwhelmed by everything. This was Arizona State University, and I got overwhelmed, and I got on the phone to Mom, and I said, Mom, I don't think I'm going to do this. I don't think college is for me. I don't think it's going to help me. I'm not going to do this. And she's like, get your ass over there. You're going to do it. Sign up for the classes because I didn't get to do it, so you're going to do it. So I had to vicariously do it, fulfill college for her because she didn't get to do it. She was certainly smart enough. So I said, okay, Mom, all right. So I went and registered for classes. Then they started college. And the first year, I lived in a dorm with a roommate, one of these skyscraper dorms that you see in Tempe. And there were always parties going on every level of the skyscraper. One or another of them had a party going on every night. And so my roommate and I, whom I got along with, he wasn't a particularly bright guy, but I did get along with him. And we just spent the nights going to all of these parties. And so my freshman year of college, I just drank my way through it. I was constantly drunk, didn't take my classes seriously, didn't really learn anything, got mostly average grades, B's and C's. I remember getting a lot of C's. I just didn't care. But then what happened was two things. What woke me up was I took a class, some sort of literature class. It might have been a survey of poetry, 20th century poetry. And we read T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland. That hit me like an atom bomb. I had had no exposure or interest in highbrow literature whatsoever up to this point. I was still reading drugstore paperbacks. And The Wasteland just blew me away. All of a sudden I had this revelation that highbrow literature isn't crap. It's not boring. It's the exact opposite. The stuff you're reading is crap. And suddenly I realized it was like being raised on a diet of McDonald's and then going to a fine foods restaurant and realizing that you've been eating crap all your life. That was what happened with The Wasteland. And I knew from Apocalypse Now, all the references to T.S. Eliot in Apocalypse Now, which was my favorite film and remains my favorite film to this day. And that did something to me. And I became obsessed with reading the poem and trying to understand it, reading all the secondary sources, reading James Frazer's Golden Bough, Jesse Weston's From Ritual to Romance, all to just unlock the secrets hidden in this poem. So that set me on the path toward highbrow literature now. And at about the same time, I met a friend who became my best friend through college, but only through college. He was an African American of descent from the Ashanti in Ghana. He was flying back and forth to Ghana every now and then. And he read a short story. He got up in front of a podium and read a short story that he had written himself. And I at once recognized his talent. It was the only individual I ever encountered who I thought was as good as I was. And so I recognized his talent immediately. And then we started talking, and we headed off. We'd read mostly the same things, same science fiction. He was also a fan of Apocalypse Now, Blade Runner. We had all these things in common interests. And he, too, was also beginning to get interested in highbrow literature. And pretty soon we were trading William Faulkner books back and forth. So I was reading William Faulkner now and starting to change my writing to give it a kind of a modernist feel to it. I was no longer interested in Stephen King or drugstore paperbacks at this point. Now I had a new bar that had been set with this highbrow literature that I wanted to leap over to become a great writer. That now became my goal as a result of this interaction with this individual. That was now my goal. I don't want to become Stephen King. I want to become James Joyce or William Faulkner. And pretty soon I did discover James Joyce as well. All that hit me. It was just amazing. It was electric, discovering all of these amazing works of literature. And my friend and I had this agonic relationship where we would try to outwrite each other. Who could write the better short story? I'd write one, pass it over to him, he'd critique it, he'd write his, pass it back to me, and we'd go back and forth, and it was an agon of competition, and it's exactly the Greek ideal of competition, and this is correct. This is what you need to have happen, and I highly recommend this to young kids coming along. You should have an agonic relationship with a friend or someone that because the agon of the strife and the struggle makes you get better and better and better. You want to keep getting better. And so the Greeks had this right. Competition makes excellence. Competition brings excellence out of you. And if you don't have it, it's like Gilgamesh and Enkidu. The two meet and neither one of them can best each other, so they become best friends. But they have to go through that agonic competition. And it just brings things out of you. And pretty soon, my stories got better. And I was writing what I would call literary stories, not trash anymore. Those days were gone. Those ideals were gone. So all of this was going on in college. We were trying to outright each other, and pretty soon my grades were getting better. I stopped drinking for the most part for the remaining 3 years of college, and I remained celibate through college because things were getting I really wanted to figure out what I could do with all of this literature. And so one day, we were walking, and I asked him what he was working on. He said, I'm going to write a short story called Myths. I was like, oh, myths like in Greek myths? And he's like, no, like in mythic characters of our contemporary landscape like James Dean or Marilyn Monroe, Marlon Brando, people like that. I've been reading this book by somebody named Joseph Campbell. It's called The Hero with a Thousand Faces. I said, oh, that's interesting. That sounds like a really cool, I can't wait to read the story. So I went home, and then pretty soon, I saw one night on PBS The Power of Myth, where Bill Moyers was interviewing Joseph Campbell in a series of episodes. And I couldn't really understand what I was hearing, but I knew at once, it was like an atom bomb that just detonated in my psyche. I knew this was it. This was the world. This was going to be my world. I had to understand everything that this guy said and read all of his books and all the books of the people that he read. I have to know what he knows. Not yet for the purpose of becoming an intellectual. All of this was to enrich my writing. I wanted to become as erudite as James Joyce or Thomas Pynchon or someone like that. And so I went home. I mentioned to my friend that I'd seen the PBS thing. He's like, yeah, great. You should read The Hero with a Thousand Faces. So I did. I read The Hero with a Thousand Faces during my last year of college, I think it was, or second to last, my junior year. So I read The Hero with a Thousand Faces, and that exploded. That was just absolutely amazing. And then The Masks of God, I started working on his 4-volume history of religion. And he kept mentioning this Spengler fellow, Spengler this. So I would go to the library now, and I was making sallies forth into the library continually, all the time now, every day, obsessively looking up all of these books and references that he was making. in his books. And I went and I dug up The Decline of the West by Oswald Spengler, and I opened it, pulled out the charts that are in the back of the book that map the morphology of civilization from its early period to its high period to its decay, with all these civilizations that had gone through the same life cycle. And that was another bomb. Blew me away. Suddenly, I had a map, what Peterson would call a map of meaning, a cognitive map that situated everything. Beethoven's string quartets now, the paintings of Rembrandt. I could see where everything fit and why it went where it went now. Suddenly, I had a cognitive map that made sense out of everything. And now, I got straight A's from that point on in all of my classes. And my writing got better. The short stories became more and more ambitious, but I was still wanting to become just a great fiction writer, not an intellectual. That never even occurred to me at this point. And so that's what I did during the last couple of years of college. And then during my junior year of college, one day I started getting a pain in the right side of my belly. It was kind of a sharp stabbing pain, and it was getting gradually worse. So I went to the ER, and they diagnosed it as stomach flu. They said, oh, you just have stomach flu. Here's some pills. Take these, and you should be good in a few days. So I went home, but the pain kept getting worse over the next week, worse and worse and worse. And it got so bad that I remember crawling in agony around the floor of my studio apartment. I was living alone at this point in a studio apartment, just crawling in agony. I couldn't figure out what to do. So finally I got on the phone with my mother. I said, Mom, I don't think this is stomach flu. I think you should come pick me up and take me to the ER. So she did. She came and picked me up, took me to her health care program place, and they examined me. They felt my torso and didn't say a word. Didn't say a word because they didn't want to scare me. They didn't want to say, like, you might die here. Your appendix has burst, and you're on the road to death. But they can't say that, obviously. So I didn't know what was going on. So they sent me over to a bigger ER at a big hospital and prepped me for surgery right away. And I was like, surgery? Jesus, what's going on? They didn't tell me. They didn't tell me a word. They just operated on me. And what they did was my appendix had already burst, and the poison had begun to spread, but it was pocketed off in a little section of my belly. So what they had to do was zip me open, open me up, take out all my intestines, and they had to vacuum all the poison off the intestines, put them all back in. I've had digestive problems ever since. All back in, packed me up all nice and neat, and they left the wound open. They didn't sew it shut because they wanted it to drain properly or whatever. So that was a nightmare. I nearly died. I came very close to death. Then they explained to me what happened after I came out of surgery the next day or two. It took me a while to recover from the anesthesia and then come back. And it was awful because they had to come into the surgery room or into the hospital room every night to dress the wound. At 3 a.m., they'd wake me up, give me painkillers, some morphine, and then take the dressing off. And even with the morphine, it was so tender that I can't even describe it. It was awful, them changing the dressing on the wound. And then before I could leave the hospital, I was in there for about a week. And before I could leave the hospital, they had to show me how to dress the wound. So I had to learn how to dress the wound. And by the way, while I was in the hospital, I had one last bit of contact with my father. My father and I had a falling out finally when I was about a year earlier. I was about 16 years old, a couple of years earlier. When I was 16 years old, I got on the phone to him one day, and he was bitchy with me and irritated at me, and I told him to go fuck himself, and I hung up. And at that point, I was determined never to speak to him again. But he did, several years later, when this happened, he did come into the hospital to visit me, and he was jovial and cracking jokes, making me laugh, which was hurting my side. And that was it. Then he disappeared, and then I didn't see him again for years after that. He was getting crazier and crazier. He still had a relationship with my brother, and my brother was giving me reports about how crazy he was getting. He was getting so crazy that he believed that people were following him around all the time, especially in traffic. He'd be driving around in traffic, believing that cars behind him were keeping tabs on him and following him. Total paranoid schizophrenia. So he was gone. He was over the rainbow. So then I came out of the hospital. I went back and I finished my last year of college. And I came out of that last year of college with a sort of triumph where I won first place in a short fiction writing contest for the Arizona State University newspaper, the campus newspaper. I won first place, and my story was there, and all the kids were reading it all over the campus. And my friend grudgingly said, "Yeah, congratulations." And that sort of brought me to a threshold with the fiction writing where I felt okay with it now, and I stopped working on it for a while, and I just wanted to read all this nonfiction now. I wanted to explore all these new possibilities with all these other things. So I finished that year, graduated. Then I moved back home with Mom, and I lived in her basement. She had moved to another house in Central Mesa, and I lived in her basement after I graduated for a year. I wasn't looking for a job, but I was trying to figure out what to do with my life, and all I was doing was reading these books for a year. I just sat in her backyard and in the basement obsessively reading all of Finnegan's Wake, which I read twice, The Decline of the West, read that again, read through all of Young's books, read through all the novels of Thomas Mann, all the poetry of Robinson Jeffers, and these were all authors that Joseph Campbell had read. So if he read them, I figured it was okay to read them. So I was just doing this archaeology of the background of his work and everything that he had read that produced him as a great thinker. So I spent the whole year reading all these guys, reading all this literature, my mind just opening up like a flower. And then after a year of that, my mom said, "You got to get a job. If you're going to stay here, you got to get a job because I'm going to college now, and I want you to help me pay for it by giving me rent money." So I said, "Okay, yeah, fair's fair." She had stopped drinking by this point. For a while there, she had been, even once she moved across town during that last year of high school, she had been driving back and forth to pick fights with my stepdad, going into his house, smashing his figurine collections, destroying his things. And I didn't witness any of those fights, neither did my brother. They were reported to my brother by my stepfather. My brother still had a relationship with him, and I didn't want to speak to him at all, ever. So both of my fathers I had no interest in speaking to again, ever. I was maturing now. I was achieving a stable ego, a stable sense of self, feeling strong about who I was now, and I wasn't going to put up with abuse from anyone at that point, no more. And then my mom, it took her a while she had to go through a few recovery programs over a few years. Then it finally took. At some point it clicked, and now she wants to go to college to become a substance abuse counselor. So I helped her pay for it for the first year that she went, and the second year that I lived at home. And what I did was I went back to ASU, and I got hired at ASU in their administrative office as a courier, a campus courier. So I was taking data and information around in a golf cart all over the campus, constantly making deliveries, and in between deliveries, sneaking down into the library to get stacks of books and look up references. I was developing an addiction problem here. I needed an intervention because I just kept reading and reading and reading. And fortunately, that library, Hayden Library at ASU, is a fantastically good library. Every book that I looked up was in that library. There was never a book that I couldn't find in that library. So it was an amazing collection. And so I had access to all this stuff, and I was reading constantly, going home, working the job. I was getting tired and exhausted and frustrated. I was still a virgin at this point, and now I was starting to get completely frustrated with the idea of being a virgin. And I'd been spending all this time reading all these books, so obviously I wasn't spending much time pursuing the opposite sex, but I thought I need to get this over with. So I went to a prostitute, and I lost my virginity to a prostitute. And I was like, great, that's over with. It didn't even feel like a threshold crossing to me. It just felt like, that's over with, so now I can get back to the books. So I did. I went back to the books and just kept reading and reading. Now, pretty soon, at this point, I didn't have any friends again. I had lost all of my college friends. The kid the African-American kid, he and I got into a dispute over something. I don't remember what it was. It was an ego battle about something, but it was decisive and it ended the relationship. And I lost that circle of friends. So once again, I was by myself and making all these deliveries. And then in the office, in the same office across from me, there was an older woman, a 40-year-old woman, a very culturally sophisticated woman who had moved from Manhattan to Phoenix. I have no idea why. I think she had just used up Manhattan. She just used it up. She'd done every substance imaginable, had all kinds of sex imaginable, and now she was frigid and sober and just straight-laced. So I was writing things on my desk, literary things, and I actually put the quote from the last line of Faust in German. I wrote it on my desk. Alles Vergängliche ist nur ein Gleichnis. And everything transitory is but a reference, a metaphor. But then word got around the office because people saw this German quote and they thought I was a neo-Nazi. And so there was this whispering going on around the office. There was a neo-Nazi, and this woman became curious. She heard about it. She came over to me, and she knew right away that I was culturally sophisticated. And then she and her friend, another 40-year-old-ish man, invited me to go have coffee with them and join their social circles. And they were all 40-year-olds. And here I was, a 21-year-old, just hanging out with all these middle-aged people who loved me, and I loved them, and we had a great time. We started going to coffee shops. We started going to art exhibits. We just hit the town, and we were doing all kinds of things. And it was really a lot of fun and very interesting. We just headed off, and it was great. But then one day, and I think I'll finish this chapter here with this little bit of a cliffhanger. One day as I was making deliveries on the campus at ASU, there was this individual that I saw walking who hitched a ride with me. And he was a Muslim terrorist, but I didn't know this at the time. He was a Tamil tiger. So we'll leave it here at that point for next time.